Okay, so yeah, just a reminder about that. And this class, though, kind of the same thing. We're going to do more stuff at the beginning of class, and that way you have a little bit more work time in class. I feel like I've kind of been eating up every minute of class for the last little while here. Yeah, what have I been thinking? But I know you need some work time, and we're starting to ramp up to this. How y'all feeling about the progress right now? That sound is crazy coming up to the ceiling. So
yeah, it's like
they are. I know it's a little.
It's okay.
Yeah, I'm on it.
I think he said he has to take that down.
Huh?
He does. He needs to take it down.
I saw John up and down.
The people that installed the panels, they took the ladder downstairs, and then Marty got the ladder, and it's too big, so they can't pick up any room. They can't change anything.
He's sad that his figure's stuck up there now.
Yeah, we'll fix it. It'll get fixed. But in the meantime, I feel like I'm competing against whatever that monotone drag is down there. So I have a lecture today. I can actually give you a video of this if this doesn't record, but I'm currently recording. My problem is every time I've tried to pop up a PowerPoint, it doesn't record. It doesn't record appropriately. It's like I think it's where they're trying to run compression on it, and it's not seeing the slides change that much. That it just holds the same frame when it's recording. So we'll try that, and if it doesn't work, I can share a live version of the presentation I gave at ECGC a while back. It's pretty much the same presentation. Having said that, it's mostly just me talking and looking at examples. So you're more than welcome to scoot to the front of the room where I don't have to compete with the voice downstairs. I'm not going to make you do it, but if you want to come on up, I'd love to have you up here. It's great up here in the front of the room. This is really where it's at, is in the front of the room. But I'm also sharing it through OBS or through Zoom if you want to watch it from your desk too. So, okay. Okay. So again, this is I didn't really change the PowerPoint very much from the presentation I gave at ECGC. I think it was last year. But it's all about demystifying the fifth principle of animation, overlapping action, because this is one that a lot of people have a lot of issues with. So I left some of the slides in there that you may already know, like who I am. So we can kind of skip past that, unless you all don't know who I am.
Who are you? Not a clue.
That's me right there. I'm that guy. Anyway, so most of this sort of starts off, again, with the illusion of life. Y'all are familiar with those 12 principles. Some of you may have them secretly tattooed on you. If not, it's a good choice for a tattoo. But again, the 12 principles, just a quick recap, they come from this book. Anybody have this book? Oh, it's awesome. Yeah, it's a big book. And really only one chapter does anything to teach you about animation, but it's a really important chapter.
The rest of it is basically just phraseologists gloating about the old Disney.
Yeah, they're like, oh. But I think one of the really interesting things is like their second book that followed up from this, I think I've mentioned this before, was just called Villains. Like the entire book was just like a smaller version of this book, but it was just about all the Disney villains. So I actually have both of them downstairs if you ever want to check them out. Anyway, chapter 3 is where the 12 principles of animation are at. And if you can't afford the book, you can just read the Wikipedia page. So again, just a quick reminder of what they are. So we've gone through all of these, but what we're really going to be looking at is number 5 here, right? Follow through and overlapping action. Where's my water bottle? There it is. I'm going to need this to stay hydrated. Yes?
Where do you think the best place to tattoo this would be?
You need a surface area large enough and flat enough to get all of those.
Now, also, would it be so you can read it or so other people can read it on you?
I mean, I already know what they are. So.
Exactly. So if I like tattoo it on my back, so every time I go swimming, people will be like, squash and swim.
Yeah, because obviously if it's a face tattoo, you've got to get them written backwards.
Yeah.
So you can see them in a mirror, right? And then it's just going to look weird.
I had my grandmother do a cross stitch of one of those so I can put it on my desk.
Oh my goodness. Can you have her make me one too? I would love that, actually. You asked what I want for my birthday? Well, Parker's grandma will make me cross stitches. So anyway, we're familiar with all these. The thing about it is like the most amount of questions I ever get about the 12 principles of animation is about number 5, right? It's like, what's the difference between follow through and overlapping action? Is that the same thing as drag? Is that the same thing as overshoot? Is that the same? And it's really like a confusing one, right? So it all sort of originated back to a comment that Walt made during a review early on. This is even before Sleeping Beauty. He said, things don't stop all at once, guys. First there's one part and then another. So although that sounds a little, like this is just a comment that he made during their dailies. And I think specifically for those of you who are doing 2D animation, that's very clear to see why that would be a problem, right? You hit a pose and it's a very easy tendency to make everything want to stop all at once. But really what's happening is some parts stop a little later, some parts get there a little earlier. And so this is the story that Frank and Ollie tell about this in chapter 3 of The Illusion of Life. This is where that came from, and they started to have to deconstruct that. So they kind of broke it up into these 5 main categories, right? Appendages like ears, coats, hair. That's going to be like overlapping action, right? So those things. We'll get into these a little bit later. The body shouldn't move all together. Some parts will stretch, other parts will catch up. So that's lead and follow. We talk about like loose, fleshy areas, right? Like, or even like clothes, right? Those drag behind, right, as they move. Or like, I think in the example that they gave was like somebody who has like a bulldog that has like really droopy jaws. Like as they move, like that skin will sort of catch up, right? Things that happen after the action, let's follow through and overshoot. And then we also have moving holds, like stuff doesn't just die in place, it kind of settles. Right? So all of these are elements, like and these words are things that you see all the time, that they're all used very interchangeably to talk about that one principle, follow through, overlapping action. So really where it gets confusing is that like when we hear this principle, really this is what we're talking about, all these different things. And I feel like it needs to be cleared up. Like we need to kind of sort through what these are and what we're really talking about. We say follow through and overlapping action, but when animators start talking about these things, they use so many different words. It's overwhelming. So that's really what most of this is about. Like, so I think it really boils down to what most things boil down to in animation, which is physics, right? Isaac Newton. How many of you have already taken physics?
Oh.
How many of you are going to take it again? Anybody? I made it through my second time. I had to take it in the summer to make sure that happened. But Isaac Newton is famous for his 3 laws of motion, all of which play a large part in the problems animators solve every day. This is where I'm reading from my notes, if you can't tell, a little less casual. But but for follow through and overlapping action, the 3rd principle is really important. Now, interestingly, even though I struggled with the physics class, I actually love physics. Like, I love the concepts behind them, or behind it. I love like quantum physics is fascinating. All of this stuff is really interesting once you take the math out of it. It's math I really don't like. The math is the problems that I have with it. So does anybody remember what the 3rd law of physics is? Isaac Newton's 3rd law of physics?
Yes.
What is it?
It's the one with the inertia. No.
For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? Obviously, and to kind of, I'm sorry if you're having flashbacks from physics, but I push against the wall in one direction, that's an action, right? And when I do that, my body moves in the other direction, that's the reaction. So for every force that is applied in one direction, there has to be a reaction in the equal and opposite direction. So this is my paraphrasing of that way he summed it up. Also, I think he wrote it in Latin. So, what did he write it in? Anyway, so how many of you have seen this before? So you all know what's going to happen. But if you haven't seen this example before, A signal takes a finite amount of time to travel from one location to the other. Right? So what's going to end up happening here is I'm going to hit play on this video, and when I do, he's going to let go of the slinky from here. Now you just sort of let it settle to this position, right? When he lets go of that slinky, for those of you who haven't seen it before, when he lets go at the top, what's going to happen at the bottom?
Top's going to go first, and then the bottom is going to slowly fall afterwards.
So the top will fall first, and then the bottom will.
Vice versa.
The bottom will fall.
First,
The bottom will fall first, and then the top will catch up. You think? So let's watch it and see. Let's see what happens. So he releases. Now look at the bottom of the slinky. Nothing is happening to it. Now I know you all, for those of you who have seen this before, you're like, you knew the answer was coming, but it's still a little unnerving just to watch, right? If you watch it when he lets go of it, it stays perfectly still, even though he's not holding it up anymore. So again, to rephrase what I'd said earlier, the signal takes a finite amount of time to travel from one location to the other. There's a specific amount of time for that signal that he has let go of the slinky to make it from the top of the slinky to the bottom of the slinky. The bottom of the slinky doesn't know it's been let go yet, right? So to kind of clarify that, an action happens and it takes time before the reaction, right? Because that signal of the action has not reached there yet. Okay. I know you all have seen this one before, right? So this is from Slow Motion. Was it slow-mo guys? Right. Yeah. So we can see this happening all throughout different systems, right? This is what that video looks like, but if we watch it up close in slow motion, right? So look at this. Like the side of his head has been hit, but his nose, the other side of his head, even his eye, none of that stuff knows yet, right? It's not gotten a signal that it's been hit. The tip of his nose still hasn't gotten a signal, even though the middle of his nose has. Look at his lips. His lips still haven't started moving forward yet. They're dragging behind. They're staying almost in the same spot. Right? So this is what we're talking about with overlapping action. Everything is a signal that has to travel throughout a system. And so since that signal takes time to travel through that system, that means everything doesn't change at once. Everything doesn't start at once. Everything doesn't stop at once. It all kind of cascades and happens at different times. So even here, his lips finally caught up, and they actually made it past his face. Like they shoot past his face. This one's like, again, like I like showing the other video first, because although it looked like, ow, why would you do that? Like when you watch this video, it looks like you need to send his family a card or something, right? Like this is like look at his nose. Look at that. His whole head changes shapes. So anyway. So, let's talk about this. Whenever we're animating something, sort of the problem with it is that by default, when we're setting stuff in this blocking phase, we end up with stuff that is very stiff, right? If I just set two keyframes, pose A, pose B, this is very stiff. It's not very interesting, right? So ways that we can improve that could be just to think about different parts of this starting and stopping at the same time. Now we know in Maya there's just a controller there at the bottom. I just animated it from point A to point B. So, so one of the ways I could think about this is the bottom of this leading and the top following, right? So what that means is halfway in between, I could just set another keyframe that looks like this, right? That just sort of has this sort of pulling behind. So, and I'm just doing that by rotating it back. And just by adding that keyframe, it makes it look like the bottom is leading and the top is sort of lagging behind. We call this drag. Right? So this is what we get just by adding that one keyframe, right? And so that adds a little bit to it. Like it's at least a little less stiff, a little less boring, right? So again, when we talk about all those different phrases, this is drag. The top of the stick is dragging on behind the other, right? Now we could always extend this a little bit more, right? We go to this end frame, and we could add another keyframe where we go past our original end pose, right, and come back. And just by adding that one more keyframe, that one more breakdown, we get something like this. So I didn't change those two key poses. I just added some more breakdowns in order to get that. So let's think of it like this. Right? This stick is pretty simple, but when I look at this overlay of it, this is more of a mass shape, right? Like a sphere, right? Like maybe even a head. Right? And so that same lead and follow, that same drag, results in a different, or something that feels kind of different with a shape, right? If we were thinking about this as your head moving, then this is your chin is leading that, and the top of your head is sort of following through, right? And so again, we get this bottom leading the action and the top following through. So it's very easy to sort of change this. Again, like if we want to make it look like the top leading, then we just have to set that middle breakdown keyframe a little differently, right? Now again, I realize this is just one body. This is just one stick, right? But this is one of the ways that we can add a little bit more overlapping action into that. And I think as you're posing, this is something to keep in mind. You can add drag into your pose without even having to offset anything or do any other elements of this. The other thing to recognize is that this kind of gives us a different feeling if we're personifying this stick, right? This feels more urgent, right? Like the stick is in a hurry because it's leading with its head or it's leading with the top to get to the other side. So if we subdivided this and just added a bunch more pieces to it, right? It still feels stiff if we just have those two keyframes. Again, we can add another breakdown keyframe where we drag in the middle just by rotating each of those sticks a little bit at a time. And then an overshoot keyframe where we go past it a little bit, right? And the result of that is going to be something like this. So that makes sense because it's pretty much just a bent version of what we had earlier. Yes?
So how do you judge whether to represent drag by a single keyframe versus offsetting keys?
So that's actually what we're getting into next here. So this is just if we just set a single keyframe to add the drag and the overshoot, right? There's no offsetting at all. All of these keys are still happening on the same frame. So it adds a little bit, but it still feels a little stiff, particularly like how it kind of stops and then shoots through and then kind of settles back all at once. So this is where we start adding offset, right? So if I have all these keyframes set on the same keyframe, we get what we just saw. But if I go through here and I offset each of these segments of this stick by a frame, right? Like we make the second one happen 1 frame later, the next one 2 frames later, the top one 3 frames later, then that's where we can kind of build on that drag that we've created in the pose, right? And so with that, we end up with something that feels a little looser, right? Now I think it's important to recognize that 1 frame is not like a rule, right? This is something that you have control of. I can offset it 2 frames, 4 frames, and 6 frames, and then basically, instead of everything hitting on the same frame, they're each hitting 2 frames later, right? And we get something that feels way looser, right? Now there's still a little bit of a snap when it gets to the end there, but that's more of the placement or the main controller issue than anything. So pose-to-pose animation, the process of this, like we're all pretty familiar with so far. Your keyframes are on all the body parts on the same frame, right? This is great for organization, timing, planning, making sure you have strong poses, etc. It's really bad for overlapping action because that means everything hits on the same frame, right? And so again, pose-to-pose animation, is where we get all of this in between. So if we're aiming for this end pose, that means everything hits at that end pose at the same time. So I think it's worth sort of thinking about how just using overlapping action or offset can allow us to loosen stuff up. Right? So we have these. All of these are individual pieces that are all hitting the top and bottom keyframes at the same point, right? The same two keyframes, the same top. So recognize that if we just offset this by 1 frame each down the line, then we're going to get we will, of course, this is the key. This is what the curve is for all of those before we offset, right? After we've offset by 1 frame down the line, we get this, right? Recognize, like before, when they're all doing, let's go back one more. When they're all doing the same thing, if I select all of them, this is what I'm going to get in the graph editor. All of their curves look exactly the same. They're just on top of each other. When I get this, when I've offset them 1 down the line all the way across, this is what the graph looks like, right? Now, this is, I know that this is just so you can sort of visualize and think about this, that really what we're getting is that peak that we're hitting there. We'll see that like it's cascading down the line. Like every time we hit that peak, the next one comes 1 frame later, right? And the result of that is what we just saw, which is this, right? So if we offset it by 2 frames, it gets even looser, right? 2 frames, 4 frames, 6 frames, all the way down. Recognize that last block that's moving up and down is hitting the top of that 20 frames later, almost a whole second later than our first object is, right? So that offsetting starts to build up, and that's why this feels way more loose, even though it's still those same exact keyframes. They're just happening at a different time. And we are able to leverage that offsetting to get a different result. So for example, if I offset them outward or inward from the outer edges, right? The ones on the edges are hitting at the same time, and then I offset 1 frame later as we move toward the center, then we get a completely different result. Right? This is sort of one of the tools you can use to kind of get a lot of different interpolations of this. So we can move to something like this. Yeah, if you could listen in. Which again is also very stiff, right? And this is just like we had those blocks hitting on the same keyframes. This, we have the rotation of all of those elements hitting on the same keyframes. Right? So just like before, if we offset 1 frame later down that hierarchy, 1 frame, 2 frame, 3 frame, right? Then we get something that feels just a little looser. Right? If we continue 2, 4, and 6, it gets way looser, right? And then 3, 6, and 9, so 3 frames down the line, we get something very swayy, right? So again, we'll go back to this. It's stiff again. And last time, how we looked at this is we offset these frames 1 frame later, right? I had the second joint 1 frame after the first joint on down the line. Well, we can do that in the other direction, right? 1 frame earlier. And so that means that end point, that end joint, is hitting that keyframe first, right? And by doing that, we're going to start getting something that feels a little different, maybe like a little bit like an earthworm sticking up out of the ground looking for something, right? If I do it 2 frames, 4 frames, 6 frames earlier, you're going to start to see a little bit of that result of that. Again, still feeling kind of like searchy, right? If we do 3 frames. So this is a very different look to this, right? Recognize that all of these are still the same keyframes. I've just adjusted at what frame those happened with the hierarchy of this in mind, right? Okay. Again, not everything has to be done with offsetting. This was a hard lesson for me to learn. Remember, the very first thing we did was set a different keyframe that just implied that drag, right? So for example, I could set a breakdown key on this that looks like this. Just a few frames into this, I could set that, and you'll notice sort of the difference between our first frame and this frame is it feels like that top piece, for the most part, is sort of still hanging back there where it started, right? But the bottom part is moving first, right? It feels like that bottom part is moving first. And this is just in the pose, makes it feel like the top hasn't received that signal yet. I could also go in here and make another keyframe where the bottom is still moving, right? And then this top part finally got the signal and sort of followed through several frames later. Just by adding those two breakdowns, I get that. Again, there's no offsetting on this yet. This is just those two keys. So the idea of posing something more dynamically in order to show that overlapping action will really help strengthen your pose. It makes the offsetting part or the polishing and splining part much easier. So then when we take that same animation and offset down the line 1, 2, and 3 frames, we get something that feels way looser. Right? So let's look at some other options here. So other types of overlapping action. So recognize that overlapping action, again, when we were talking about physics, is a result of an action, right? And so sometimes overlapping action is just this residual motion that happens in something when it's moving, right? Like if something is being shaken, right, then we'll see other parts of it sort of jiggle and bobble around, right? On some level, this is something you'll see in the secondary action of something, right? Like a character's hair bobbing around, a character's clothes bobbing around, right? And so something like this feels very stiff without any additional secondary action, overlapping action. And so just to add a little bit of something like that makes it feel like it's all kind of following through. So nothing moves in isolation. That is something that is important to recognize just period about animation. Sometimes overlapping action is just the residual motion that comes from being connected to something else, right? It's not that these are trying to swing, it's that they have no choice because they're hooked to this bobbing thing, right? So I use this as an example because this is something that character animators get wrong a lot, right? It's an arm wave. And animators have this tendency to be like, okay, he's waving his arm, so I only need to set keyframes on the arm. But like, his whole body moves from that wave. He can't stop himself from moving. Obviously, it's a very enthusiastic wave. But when he does that, like his chest shakes, his head shakes. If you're doing muscle simulation, you're seeing like muscles that jiggle from that. Overlapping action is sort of built into everything we do because our bodies are interconnected, right? My arm is not disconnected from my torso, so when it moves, it affects the rest of my body, right? Okay, so we're in character animation though, right? So I want to talk about some of these elements and how they connect to a character. So currently, this motion it's not fully polished, but I've done like the splining, all of that to this animation. And what we're seeing is, in this case, our character is leading with the hips as they take this step over, right? And you'll kind of notice that the hips go first, and sort of the rest of the body kind of reacts to that. The upper body, the arms, and the head kind of drag behind that, right? So this is really helpful. Some of you are using this character, the bony character. You can isolate parts of this character, right? So if we look at the hips, we're seeing lots of overlapping action happen even here. So for example, that foot goes forward, right? And then the hips kind of follow through afterwards, right? The hips kind of drag after. So when we're talking about lead and follow, the foot is leading that action, and the hips are following, and then the other foot follows behind that. Right? So they're not all happening at the same time, and this is because some of that was built into the posing, some of that was built into the overlapping action. If we look at the torso, we can see that this is reacting very similar to like a pendulum, right? Like the pendulum exercise we had in reverse order. The hips are moving in one direction, and the whole spine and head is almost reacting to that, right? We get this overshoot at the end. And we can kind of analyze that if we sort of break this up into the shapes that it's made up of. So of course we look at this. We can see this character's pelvis, rib cage, and head. And this is how I like to think of those. So we're going to see those start to move here in a second. The first thing you'll notice is the pelvis starts going in that direction. The chest kind of follows along after that. And then later the head starts to catch up, right? Now, in just a few seconds here, the pelvis is going to change directions, right? It's going to start moving in this direction. But recognize the head still hasn't gotten that signal. It's still traveling in the other direction. The chest is finally catching up, and then the head does right there, right? Now, as we continue to step across, you'll see we're dragging the head and the chest, and then we get to here, and the pelvis starts to change directions, but again, the chest and the head are still traveling in that direction. And then finally, we kind of settle to a stop. The pelvis stops, but the chest keeps going, and the head keeps going. Let me just kind of get this residual settle at the end there. Okay, so when we analyze stuff like the arms, we can see that happening here too, right? We can see the lead and follow, that it kind of feels like the arms, the hands, the fingers are sort of reacting to that step over in one direction and the settle in it. And so when you put all of that together, we get what we had at the very beginning of this, right? So sort of the opposite of that is to lead with the upper body, right? We get something like this, where the character is stepping forward, sort of leading with the head and the chest, right? Now, that doesn't mean that everything is leading, like the hands and the arms are still kind of following behind, right? So let's break this up into the pelvic system. So again, the foot is leading. The foot really leads, and then actually the foot will lead in almost every step that you'll do, because feet are, your foot has to get there before your body does, or you'll fall, right? So that's why you'll see he sort of throws his foot out there in front of him in order to absorb that weight of his hips and body as it's stepping through, right? Now, if we break this up into the upper body, you'll see that the head is it's kind of like he's like spearing the air with his head, right? He's like jabbing his head forward. So let's sort of break that down into those body masses again, right? So again, the body sort of moves back kind of together. The hips lead that just a little bit, right, until we get to right here. And you'll see right here, these next few frames, the head starts leaning forward, but the hips haven't really started moving forward yet, right? And then they just kind of continue to jab that head forward, right? It's like it's almost like those lower masses, the hips and the chest, are almost like pushing the head, rather like nudging it forward. And then sort of pushing the head upward in this arc. Now here's something to kind of pay attention to. As we reach this point and the bottom starts to stretch our character back down, let me go back a few frames so you can see that. Look at the distance between the chest and the hips. So, see how it starts to stretch there? The bottom starts to pull that down. There's like that stretch in that midsection. Right there, we get this really wide stretch. And then as we come back down here toward the ground, right here, we get that squash of those two pieces kind of going together. And then eventually we sort of settle back into this. So if you are animating, a few more keys on this. There we go. Let me go back one. So if you're animating a quadruped, how many of you are animating a quadruped, right? This is very important parts of that. This is stuff that's very evident in a quadruped, is those three masses and how they relate to each other. Especially that squash and stretch and lead and follow parts of that, right? So when we build from that, we're just going to add these arms onto it, and you'll see that the arms are sort of reacting just a little bit to the torso. Now, the character's left arm kind of starts to lead forward by kind of like this gesture, but really by the end of it, they're both just sort of dragging along behind and flopping through there, right? So this is something we're going to see in a lot of animations, and they're conscious decisions that you have to make as the animator, right? So this is one that you've probably seen before. I worked on this one for Battleborn. And in this one, it's pretty obvious where the lead and follow is, right? The hips are sort of throwing themselves forward, or he's throwing his hips forward. The chest, the head, sort of dragging behind that. And then very last is that arm. That arm sort of flips through. The very last thing that gets to that destination is the hand and those fingers, right? The result of that is this sort of whip action feel to it, and it makes the impact of that feel much stronger. Now, it doesn't mean that everything is reacting in that way. Some things lead, like for example, the right arm kind of leads some of this action a little bit, and but it is a very strong way of getting that whip action out of what was really just a couple of strong poses. I also think it's important to recognize that this is not consistent throughout a whole animation, right? This is 2 clips from the same animation that I did. And the beginning of it, we get this lead and follow that starts with her shoulder, right? She's dragging her hand back as she makes this gesture. It's kind of a throwaway gesture, like a get out of here almost, right? And so the offsetting that is happening and the overlapping action is a combination of sort of some paused poses that we could look at here. Let's see, right about, apparently I can't do that. Apparently frame by framing is not something you can do in PowerPoint. But you'll see that drag pose where like she's bringing her elbow up first, and kind of has her arm sort of like this, right? And then the follow through as she goes to the top. But then there's that offset too, that is offsetting down the arm in order to get that cascading effect. Now, the very next gesture she does after that, though, is another point. And it's the opposite. It's leading with the hand. In fact, it leads with the finger. And then her head is kind of reacting a little bit after that, right? So you're mixing it up. Each of these have different intentions, right? Again, if this first one is a throwaway gesture, like very, very angry, get out of here, like angry gesture to it, that's what you're going to get out of that feeling, right? She's trying to make a point here, though. Right? No really pun intended with that pointing finger, but she's trying to emphasize something. And so with that would feel much better. That feels much better with the hand leading that action than if the elbow were leading that action, because that would still feel like a throwaway gesture, right? Like it's not an important comment to her. She's still like just wanting you to leave, right? She's feeling like she's made a very crucial point or comment here. So I think it's most important to recognize in all of this, though, that Maya, Toon Boom, whatever, they're just software, right? They're not the ones that are doing this. It's not going to create the overlapping action for you, and it shouldn't create the overlapping action for you because that's your job, right? Overlapping action is an element of how things move naturally. But how you use it in animation is a choice, right? It's something that you have to decide how to leverage in order to sort of change what you're trying to communicate in your action. So an animator's job is to be in control of that, and if you want your work to be competitive, like showing that you're capable of that is really essential. So that's one of the reasons I kind of put together this whole presentation. One of the things that is often notable as student work is not having enough or not having appropriate overlapping action. This is a concept that is kind of easy to grasp when we're having a conversation about this, but becomes really kind of challenging to implement into your pieces, right? So this is why I wanted to have a talk about it early on, particularly while you're in this phase, while you're in the splining mode of this, because at this point you can start making those decisions. Some of those decisions may be by altering some poses. Some of those may be by offsetting some keyframes as you're animating. But either way, it's something that needs to be in your animation and used in a way that is a creative tool, not just like blanket applying overlapping action down the line to everything, right? Questions? Ideas? How many of you have started into the graph editor already? Okay. All right, so that means the rest of you just need to keep this in mind when you get there, right? And if you would like to add me on LinkedIn, you're more than welcome. Seriously, any questions or comments on this, or thoughts, like concerns about how you're going to implement this?
So is it more advantageous to have those, since we're doing these animations pose to pose, is it more advantageous to have those offset keyframes, or no, is it to have the offset action in the keyframe or to offset it in the graph editor?
I think you can only get so much from offsetting it in the graph editor, right? So like if I were to go back to way back here before all these little, well, this is why my PowerPoints are so big, by the way. Where were we at? Is it this one? So this animation here, right? If I went into the graph editor and offset those keyframes, nothing's going to change in this, right? So for some of them, like offsetting may help loosen it a little bit, but if you don't have that, if it's a very serious drag or very like you're actually seeing the results of that drag, right? I think you have to do a little bit of both.
Okay.
Sometimes you can just offset what you have and it helps loosen it up. But really what I do is I use my breakdown pass to really think about where I might need to see that drag and offset later. So or overshoot later. So maybe I'll add the overshoot key or even the ease in key while I'm setting my breakdowns. And that way, adding offsets on your keys later just emphasizes that a little bit more. I found that sometimes if I did a really good job at breaking that down, I don't have to offset, because if I offset, it almost makes it too loose.
Yeah.
So offsetting isn't like a requirement. It's a tool that you would use to attempt to leverage that, right? So again, this wouldn't even make, like offsetting these, you would still get the same animation. It's not until you added these keys in that you are able to get, sort of this built into it, and then the offsetting just kind of adds to it to make it even more loose. And even after that, the real polish pass would be to go back in there one more time and make all those like it feels like that drag holds just a little bit long before it sort of pops up at the end, and that's just some stuff I would adjust in the graph editor to kind of fix that. Questions? Other questions? Is this helpful? This is good. Okay.
Is this PowerPoint in the folder?
It can be. You want it to be?
Yes, please.
Okay.
What's your LinkedIn information?
Yeah. How many of you have a LinkedIn account? Okay.
I didn't make one in high school.
Everybody else needs to go make one. I think it's something like 70% of all new jobs comes from a social connection. So like you want your social connections to be people who are already working in the animation industry. Not your aunt on Facebook. I mean, that's nice too. Like, I'm not saying unfriend your aunt. That would be mean. But the PowerPoint. That's what he said. So what I'll do? Copy. Classes. Greg. So after having looked at that, I would recommend checking out that splining checklist again, because I kind of talk about when would be a good time to start offsetting and stuff like that. And in all honesty, like, I don't do the offsetting until kind of late in the splining pass, right? I get all those little hitches and all the little stuff. Like, I try to see if I can pull it off without having to offset it all, just by changing my curves one at a time. And then I try the offsetting to see if it makes it better or if I'm making it too loose. And you're going to be doing a little bit of offsetting just as you're polishing the curves anyway, just one key at a time. Other questions, comments? All right. So there's no homework due today, but what I would like to do is have you all break out into your critique groups. So it is 12:18. I know you all maybe take a minute or two to pull up some files, but let's say in like 5 minutes or so, go ahead and break up into the critique groups just so you can chat with people. And this is just a chance to touch base with your group. If I'm not grading this in any way, but I think it's a good habit to get into to have those conversations on a daily basis and just see what your progress is. So. All right. Otherwise, the rest of the class is yours. So thank you, and I'll upload this video, assuming it actually recorded anything. Yes.
So something like the bony rig.
Mm-hmm.
Say I want to have, like, I want to do like a head turn, and I want to have, because essentially what we're talking about is like the 3D version of a smear frame.
Mm-hmm. Oh, with the breakdowns.
Yeah.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. So is that a rigging thing? Whether or not the rig will allow you to smear it like that? Or is there a way to manipulate certain like scales?
Yeah, sometimes you can do a little bit of that. Like if you're wanting a smear frame, like that's why you see some characters that don't seem like they should have bendy controls will still have bendy controls, where you can make your arm look like the C shape, and that's for that reason. And so you can get that breakdown right in the middle where you kind of go to a C, and then you're back to straight again, and that kind of gives it that smear frame effect. To get like really clear smear frames is not easy. I can show you some tricks that people use.
Oh yeah.
Actually, I'll go ahead and leave this continuing to run here. To log into Facebook, you have to see all the stuff that people post. So I have one that I saved a while back that is sort of somebody making a version of like the Spider-Verse type smears, and what he's doing is he duplicates it. He just gets that leg, right? And then he creates a pose where that one leg is visible twice, right? And you're kind of getting that feeling of a smear frame.
Oh.
So that's just sort of a one manipulation you could do with it, and then it just hides it again after that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So all he did is so there's a way you can do he's finding the pose that he needs. So if you look at this, like he finds that pose, and then he's just duplicating the mesh and just deleting those other polygons. So all he has left is that leg.
Yeah.
And then you can just move that leg however you need to get like this smear frame like that.
That's actually really, that's actually not hard to implement.
Yeah.
Because it's just hiding polygons.
Yeah. So.
Army of the Confederacy
No.
was.
Does that work with motion blur?
I imagine you could use motion blur. Imagine you could use motion blur.
Why did you have to immediately send me to something stupid? Sorry.
So would that still work with motion blur? Even though it's not in motion, is it?
Well, so what he's doing is he is animating that one leg changing a little bit. But yeah, I think if it's moving, you'll get a little bit of motion blur, and you're going to get the other motion blur on the leg that isn't moving too.
Because I mean, you could just do real motion blur as opposed to processing.
Right, yeah. Like, do like actual motion blur. And I think that's sort of there's other things you can do too. I mean, another example of what they did in the Spider-Verse is they just took single rendered frames and went in there and just drew over them.
Yeah.
And so what you could do is if you're wanting that smear frame feel real in the middle of it, find that middle of that fast action, and in your render you could go in there, just use the smudge tool to like, you know, to cone stamp stuff and stuff like that, just to get that final image of that.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think there's methods of doing it. I would kind of wait until the animation is polished before you make that decision.
Yeah.
And I am now going to close down Facebook before it does something stupid again. So, any questions?
I have an unreal question.
An unreal question. That's unreal. I'm going to stop.